Hi, just wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about why you're here today.
Well, I was one of the founders of the Stop the War Coalition when we first built it back in 2002, and I've been on all the demonstrations. We've organised this demonstration today, which is the 20th demonstration we've organised, because we believe it's important to keep pressure on the British government to get out of Iraq. To be honest, we've been partly successful. The British troops are now holed up in Basra airport. They're not any longer on patrol or performing any useful military function. They're just there because it's too embarrassing for this government and for the Bush administration to get them home. So we want to put pressure on the government to have one final push to get them out of Iraq altogether, and also to get the troops out of Afghanistan.
Speaking of Afghanistan, on that front, what sort of progress has the demonstration, Stop the War Coalition, these types of demonstrations, is that affecting Afghanistan as well?
Well, I think it makes it very much more difficult for the government to justify the intervention in Afghanistan. Obviously, one of the things that's happened over the years since the original occupation of Iraq is that the focus has shifted, at least for European troops, and to a certain extent for Canadian troops as well in North America, from Iraq to Afghanistan. Now, we don't want the troops out of Iraq just so they can go and fight in Afghanistan, so it's important to keep the pressure on the government. We believe we broke a Prime Minister over this question in this country. We believe that Tony Blair, in his speech after the last general election, said he wanted to serve until 2010. I think he was forced out because of anti-war pressure, because of the huge demonstration that we held because he backed the invasion of Lebanon in 2006. And our message to Gordon Brown is, if you pursue the same policies, you'll go the same way, because we're going to continue to march and agitate until all the troops are home from both Iraq and Afghanistan.
And just on the note of protesting in public, new legislation's come in the last year, which you're probably well familiar with, having to seek permission within 1 square mile of the Houses of Parliament. Yeah. How has that affected your organization and how you approach these sort of events?
Well, we find that if you've got enough numbers, the police tend to treat you rather differently. They tried this on us in the demonstration that we had in October. They went right to the brink. I was in the square when, on the morning of the demonstration, when they could see the size of the crowd building here, a senior police officer came into the square and said, "Okay, we're going to let you march." And that's our attitude to it. We think this is a profoundly undemocratic piece of legislation, and we are going to defend the right to protest, as well as to continue on the substantive issues that we've mobilised for.
Is your organisation lobbying towards overturning that legislation? Because I think this legislation can be construed as unconstitutional or against basic rights that have been held by people in this country for quite a few hundred years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're very much in support of all the demands to repeal the legislation. But as you can see today, we don't take very much notice of it. The final rally of this demonstration will be in Parliament Square. That's where we're marching to from Trafalgar Square. And so, as far as we're concerned, that piece of legislation has very little meaning as far as this movement's behaviour is concerned.
So did you try to seek a permit for this this demonstration?
No, I don't believe we did. We do have discussions with the police before all demonstrations, mainly actually to secure the safety of the demonstrators. And we insist on those occasions on having the route that the protesters want to have. We've had some very big confrontations. The police, on the huge demonstration on the 15th of February 2003, didn't want to let us have Hyde Park. We forced them to do so. When George Bush was here for the presidential visit later that year, they didn't want us to march down Whitehall because they said it was too close to where the president did. But we won that battle. We won the battle last October, and we're going to continue to march where we feel is the most appropriate place for people to give their feelings adequate expression.
Do you? What are your thoughts on? There are certain elements of the mainstream media that, to an extent, promote the war agenda when the war drums are beating. I think it goes without saying which mainstream newspapers fall into that category, or even which networks for that reason. But what are your thoughts on these elements of the mainstream media and their role in making the war agenda more palpable or more of a reality when it comes time?
Well, they're very powerful instruments allied to the government. This is absolutely true. But the big lesson of this movement is even when it has that kind of resistance from the media, the government doesn't necessarily win the ideological battle. There have been for years now a majority of people in this country opposed to the war, and there is a majority of people now opposed to the war in Afghanistan as well. 62% of people in this country want the troops out within a year. So the lesson for us is, if you organise at a grassroots level, if you develop your own ways of communicating with people, some of the oldest ways have proved to have been some of the most effective for us. To have public meetings, which people said before this campaign were dead as a political tool, but we've held hundreds of them in towns and cities and villages all around this country. If you protest and march and find your own ways of getting into the media, and sympathetic journalists will help you, then you can win the battle for public opinion, and that's what we've done.
Do you, are there any other institutions that you think are supporting the war agenda? Particularly, we're talking about the financial institutions, the central banks. Throughout history, it's been shown that these are institutions that really a war can't happen without the finances of the central banks.
Well, yes, and I think it's now widely accepted, and this is another achievement of the anti-war movement, that there was a corporate agenda behind the invasion of Iraq, in the first instance from the oil companies, but more broadly from big business as well. The very same people, incidentally, who are the beneficiaries of the privatisation of the London Underground in this city were also some of the corporate gainers from the invasion of Iraq. Bechtel and McAlpine and the big building contractors and so forth. So we've made that point repeatedly in the anti-war movement, and I think it's a more relevant point perhaps today than any other, because not only can people now see that the system on a military level is a disaster for ordinary people, but with the increasing depth of the recession, they can see that the economic system that promoted the war is also a disaster for them.
How important is Britain's involvement in a wider war effort for someone like the United States? Do you think it's essential that they have Britain's support for it to be an internationally viable move for the United States to, like we saw in 2003, for instance?
Militarily, the British are unimportant for the United States. Probably a single division of the US military would more than compensate for anything that the British contribute at a military level. Politically, they are important. Politically, they make it seem as if it isn't just the American superpower acting unilaterally. They allow the American government to portray it as a coalition when it's not. And so we think that it would be very much more difficult for the American government to sustain the war effort if we can knock the British government out of its participation in that effort.
Thank you very much. And if you could just tell us your name.
My name's John Rees. I'm one of the founders of the Stop the War Coalition.
And would you object to this footage being used for documentary purposes only?
No, you're welcome.